The wedding was supposed to be the happiest day of their lives. The kind of moment people dream about, a grand celebration of love, trust, and forever. Family and friends gathered, the air thick with laughter, the scent of fresh flowers, and the clinking of champagne glasses. But behind the polished smiles and carefully planned vows, a secret was waiting to shatter everything. A betrayal so deep, so unthinkable, that it would send one man down a path no one saw coming. Because when James stood at the altar, looking at the woman he loved, he had no idea that just hours before, she had been in the arms of his best man, the one person he trusted more than anyone. The man who stood by his side, who smiled as he handed him the ring. He was the one who had already taken everything from him. James had always believed in loyalty. He wasn't just some naive romantic. He knew relationships had their ups and downs. But this was beyond anything he could have imagined. When the truth came out, it didn't just break him, it changed him. A man who had spent years being kind, being patient, being the good guy, finally reached his breaking point. And what he did next? Well, no one could have predicted it. Not his bride, not the best man, and certainly not the people who thought they knew him. It wasn't rage that took over. It wasn't a violent outburst or some reckless act of revenge. No, James was smarter than that. What he did was something far worse. Something calculated. Something cold. And when it was all over, people wouldn't know whether to call him a villain or a genius. But let's rewind for a second. Because before everything spiraled out of control, before James made the decision that would change all their lives forever, there were signs, subtle ones, quiet whispers of a truth he wasn't ready to see. A misplaced glance, a hesitation in her voice, a moment between them that didn't sit right. Looking back, maybe he should have known. Maybe he should have seen it coming. But when love blinds you, you don't see the storm until it's already tearing through your life. And by the time James finally uncovered the truth, it was far too late. The wedding was over, the damage was done, and the only thing left was a choice. A choice that would turn this story into something no one would ever forget. And trust me, you won't see this coming. James had always been the kind of man people respected. He wasn't flashy, wasn't the loudest voice in the room, but he carried himself with a quiet confidence that drew people in. He built his life on trust, on loyalty, on the belief that if you treated people right, they'd do the same in return. That belief shaped everything: his friendships, his career, and most importantly, his relationship with Emily. They had been together for 5 years, a love story that, to anyone on the outside, looked unshakable. They weren't perfect, but who was? They fought, they made up, they dreamed of their future. A home, a family, a life built together. James never once thought he had to doubt her. And maybe that was his first mistake. In the months leading up to the wedding, things had felt different, but he had convinced himself it was just the stress. The endless planning, the pressure to make everything perfect, it could make anyone act a little off. Emily had been distant, always distracted, always somewhere else, even when she was right next to him. She'd brush it off with a tired smile, say she was just overwhelmed, that work was draining her, that she couldn't wait for the honeymoon when they could finally breathe. And James believed her. He had no reason not to. But now, standing in the wreckage of what was supposed to be the best day of his life, every one of those little moments came rushing back like pieces of a puzzle he never realized were missing. And at the center of it all was one person he never expected to betray him: Ryan, his best man. Ryan had been James's closest friend since college. They had been through everything together: late-night study sessions, heartbreaks, job struggles, and all the things that forged a bond meant to last a lifetime. He had always been the guy James could count on, the one who never hesitated to have his back. If anyone had asked James to name one person he trusted unconditionally, it would have been Ryan. And that's what made all of this so much worse. Because if the betrayal had come from a stranger, maybe it wouldn't have hit so hard. But this was a knife straight to the heart. The worst part was, James had no idea how long it had been going on. Had it started recently, in some weak moment? Or had they been lying to him for months, maybe years? That question gnawed at him, eating away at what little sanity he had left. But something about it didn't add up. The more he thought about it, the more something felt off. It was too perfect, too clean. The kind of betrayal you'd see in a movie, not in real life. James had always been a rational thinker, and even in his rage, his mind refused to let go of the inconsistencies. Emily wasn't the type to take risks like this. She was careful, calculating even. And Ryan? He had always been reckless, but never stupid. If they were really having an affair, why would they be so careless? Why now, of all times? And then there was the way he found out, almost too easy, as if someone had wanted him to. A misplaced text, a hushed conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. It was almost as if the truth had been left out for him, waiting to be discovered. But why? Who would want to destroy his wedding like this? And if Emily and Ryan weren't the only ones playing a game, then the real question wasn't just about betrayal. It was about something far more dangerous. James wasn't sure what was worse, the idea that the two people he loved most had betrayed him, or the creeping feeling that he was being led into something much bigger. Either way, he wasn't going to sit back and let it happen. He had spent years being the guy who always did the right thing, the guy who let things go, who forgave too easily. But not this time. This time, he was going to do something different. Something no one would see coming. Because if there was one thing James had learned, it was that trust was nothing more than an illusion. And he was done being fooled. James knew he couldn't let this go. He couldn't just accept what had happened and move on like nothing had changed. But the more he tried to make sense of it all, the more the truth seemed to slip through his fingers. He started looking for anything, messages, photos, receipts, some kind of proof that would tell him just how deep this betrayal ran. But just when he thought he was getting close to something, the evidence disappeared. The incriminating text message he had read on Emily's phone, gone, erased, as if it had never existed. The conversation he had overheard between Ryan and Emily, the one that made his stomach turn. When he confronted them separately, neither of them said a word that matched what he had heard. It was as if they knew he was onto them and had cleaned up the mess before he could get his hands on it. Or worse, someone else had stepped in to cover it up. Then came the warning. It happened late at night, long after most of the wedding guests had left, when James was alone, pacing the dimly lit hotel hallway, replaying everything in his head. A voice low, urgent came from behind him. "Let it go, James." He turned, but no one was there. He wasn't sure if it was exhaustion playing tricks on him or if someone had actually been watching him, waiting for the right moment to deliver that message. But the meaning was clear. Someone didn't want him digging any deeper. And if that wasn't enough to set off alarm bells, the next discovery nearly broke him. It was an old email, buried deep in a folder he hadn't checked in years, from a name he never thought he'd see again, Daniel Carter. Just reading it sent a shiver down his spine. Daniel had once been part of their group, back in college, before he disappeared without a trace. No one knew what happened to him, and honestly, no one really asked. He had been reckless, unpredictable, always stirring up trouble, always dragging Ryan into things they shouldn't have been involved in. And then one day, he was gone. The last time James had seen him, it was after a night of drinking, a heated argument between him and Ryan about something James was never meant to hear. Now, years later, his name resurfaced in James's inbox. The email was short, just a single line. You should never trusted him. No sender, no timestamp, no trace of where it came from. Just those 6 words, sitting there like a ghost from the past, dragging up questions James didn't even know he should be asking. Something bigger was happening here. This wasn't just about Emily cheating. This wasn't just about Ryan breaking their friendship. There was something underneath it all, something James had never seen before. And the worst part? He wasn't sure who to believe anymore. If Ryan and Emily were lying, they weren't the only ones. Someone else was pulling the strings. Someone who wanted James to stop asking questions. But James had already gone too far to turn back now. Because if this went deeper than betrayal, if there was something in his past that he had missed, then whatever came next wasn't just about finding the truth. It was about survival. James wasn't the only one being pulled into this. Just when he thought he was the only person tangled in whatever this was, he got a call that changed everything. It was Lauren, Emily's maid of honor, and one of the few people James still thought he could trust. She sounded shaken, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she was afraid someone might be listening. "James, I think something's wrong," she said. "I got a message too." His grip on the phone tightened. "What do you mean?" There was a pause, then a deep breath before she continued. "It was slipped under my door. No name, no explanation, just one line." Another pause. "You're asking the wrong questions." That was enough to send a cold wave of unease through James's entire body. He had assumed that whoever was behind this was targeting him specifically because of Emily, because of Ryan, because of whatever secrets had been buried in his past. But if Lauren was being warned too, then this was bigger than he thought. He rushed to meet her at the hotel bar, where she sat in the corner, her usual confidence replaced with something far more vulnerable. She slid the note across the table, and sure enough, the words were typed on a plain, unmarked sheet of paper. No handwriting, no clues, just a warning that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Lauren had been Emily's best friend for years, but she had always been closer to James than most of Emily's other friends. She was the kind of person who noticed things, who asked questions that made people uncomfortable. And now, she was just as much a target as he was. "I don't know what's going on, James," she admitted, her fingers nervously tapping against her glass. "But I don't think this is just about Emily and Ryan. I think someone wants to make sure you never find out what's really happening." Before James could respond, something else threw everything into chaos. His phone buzzed with a new email, and his blood ran cold when he saw the sender. Daniel Carter. It didn't make sense. Daniel was gone. He had disappeared without a trace, hadn't been heard from in years. But there it was, clear as day, his name staring back at James as if he had never left. He hesitated for a moment before opening it. "You think this started at the wedding? You're wrong. It started years ago. And if you don't stop now, you won't like what you find." James read it 3 times, his pulse pounding in his ears. His first instinct was that someone was playing with him. But then Lauren spoke again, her voice laced with something between fear and realization. "James, what if Daniel never disappeared? What if he's been here all along?" It was a terrifying thought, but not as terrifying as the alternative. What if Daniel wasn't trying to warn him? What if he was trying to control what James found out? And if that was true, then who else was involved? Because now, it wasn't just about Emily. It wasn't just about Ryan. The past was clawing its way back, and James was starting to realize that he might not have been the victim of a simple betrayal. He might have been part of something much, much darker. And the worst part, he had no idea how deep it really went. James had always believed that fear was something you could push down, something you could rationalize away if you just kept your head straight. But that belief shattered the moment he realized he was being watched. It started subtly, just an uneasy feeling at first, the kind that made his skin prickle when he walked down an empty hallway or sat alone in his car too long. Then came the glimpses. A dark figure standing just far enough away that he couldn't make out a face. A car that seemed to be parked outside his hotel, no matter what time he came or went. The feeling that someone was just a step behind him, always watching, always waiting. At first, he told himself he was imagining it, that his paranoia was getting the best of him. But then, someone was gone. Lauren. She had been the only person left that he trusted, the only one who seemed to believe that something much bigger was happening. And now, she wasn't answering her phone. He tried calling, texting, nothing. No response. He drove to her apartment, knocking hard enough to make the door shake, but there was no answer. The neighbors hadn't seen her since last night. Her car was still in the parking lot, but she was nowhere to be found. That was when the fear stopped being something he could push down. It sank in, deep and cold, the realization that whatever this was, it wasn't just about secrets or betrayals anymore. It was about survival. James didn't know who to turn to. He couldn't go to Emily, not after what had happened. He couldn't go to Ryan, not after what he had done. The police? What could he even say? That his best friend's fiancée had cheated on him, and now people were disappearing. That someone who had been missing for years was sending cryptic emails. No, they'd look at him like he was losing his mind. Maybe he was. But then, as he sat in his car outside Lauren's apartment, staring at his phone, another message came in. Not from Daniel this time. This one was worse. It was a video. He hesitated before opening it, his hands shaking in a way he wasn't used to. When he finally pressed play, his stomach turned. The footage was grainy, taken from a distance, but there was no mistaking what he was looking at. James's mind raced. The place where it all started. Did they mean the wedding? No, that was just the spark, not the source. Then it hit him. It wasn't about Emily, and it wasn't about Ryan. This went further back, years back. College. The night Daniel disappeared. That was the moment everything shifted, the moment their past had fractured into something dark and unspeakable. Someone wanted him to go back there. Someone was forcing his hand. But this wasn't just about finding the truth anymore. It was about survival. James had two choices. Walk straight into the trap, risk everything to save Lauren, and finally uncover what had been haunting him for years. Or turn away, run, pretend none of this was happening, and live knowing that his decision had cost someone their life. The choice should have been easy. He wasn't the kind of person who ran. He wasn't the kind of person who let people suffer because of his mistakes. But the deeper he got, the clearer it became that whoever was pulling the strings didn't just want to hurt him. They wanted to break him. And the worst part, James wasn't sure he had the strength left to stop them, but he had no choice. He had to go back, because if he didn't, then whoever had been orchestrating this wasn't just going to stop. They were going to make sure James lost everything before they were through with him. The only question left was who was waiting for him on the other side. You said, push the story toward its climax by Rhett. James barely remembered the drive. His hands were locked onto the steering wheel, knuckles white, his mind racing through every possibility, every outcome, none of them good. He had made his decision the moment he saw Lauren in that car. He couldn't turn back now. The past had been clawing at him for years, and he was finally about to face it head-on. The old campus loomed in the distance, dark and silent, a ghost of the life he had left behind. He parked near the abandoned dorm, where they used to sneak in after hours, where too many secrets had been whispered, where everything had gone wrong the night Daniel vanished. If this was where it all started, then this was where it would end. The air felt heavier as he stepped out of the car, his pulse a steady roar in his ears. Every shadow felt like a threat, every sound like a warning. He expected someone to jump out at him, expected a fight, a gun, something, but instead, his phone buzzed. Another message. Inside. He swallowed hard, pushing open the rusted door. The place was exactly as he remembered it, empty, forgotten. The walls still covered in the remnants of a past he had tried to forget. And then, in the middle of the room, a chair. And in that chair, tied and barely conscious Lauren. James rushed to her, heart hammering, But before he could even reach her, a voice stopped him cold. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." He turned sharply, his breath catching in his throat. From the shadows, someone stepped forward, and when James saw who it was, his entire body went rigid. Emily. Not bound. Not scared. Standing there, calm, composed like she had been waiting for him. His mind refused to process it. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. "No, you. This isn't." But then, another voice. One that sent a fresh wave of dread through him. "He still doesn't get it." And there, emerging from the darkness, was Ryan. James felt like the ground had been ripped out from under him. This wasn't just a betrayal. This wasn't just Emily cheating or Ryan lying. This was something deeper, something darker, something that had been playing out long before he ever saw that text message at the wedding. Ryan sighed, shaking his head like he pitied James, like he was tired of the act. "You really thought you were just unlucky? That this was all just some random mess you stumbled into?" He smirked, but there was no humor in it. "God, James, you never even questioned why it happened like this. Why now?" James's mind raced, connecting the pieces, but nothing fit. You sent those messages? The warnings? The threats?" His voice cracked as he looked between them. Emily's eyes were unreadable, her expression eerily neutral, but Ryan was practically amused. "Some of them," Ryan admitted. "Some were us. Some weren't." James's stomach twisted. "Daniel," he whispered. Ryan's smirk faded. Emily finally spoke. Daniel was never missing. The words slammed into James like a freight train. His breath hitched, his body stiffened, and for a moment he thought he had misheard her. But no, she had said it. The one thing that changed everything. "Bullshit," James spat. "We searched for him. The police." Ryan laughed a dry, bitter sound. The police were never going to find him. Because Daniel didn't run. He was taken. James could barely think, barely breathe. By who? Emily tilted her head slightly, her expression calm. By us. The room spun. His hands clenched into fists, every instinct screaming at him to do something, to fight, to run, to stop listening. But he couldn't move. His own fiancée, his own best friend. They weren't just involved. They were the ones pulling the strings. Ryan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This isn't about you, James. It never was. You were just a loose end we had to tie up." James felt a slow, icy realization settle over him. Then why all of this? Why the wedding? The cheating, the messages, the threats? If I was just a loose end, why not just? His voice faltered. Emily sighed. "Because we needed to know if you remembered." James shook his head, his mind spinning. "Remember what?" Ryan leaned in, his voice barely above a whisper. "The night Daniel disappeared. You were there." James's blood ran cold. Memories he had buried long ago clawed their way to the surface, flashes of laughter, of alcohol, of Daniel shouting, of a fight, of someone falling. And then everything went black. James staggered back, his breath coming in ragged gasps as the weight of Ryan's words crashed over him. "You were there." His mind scrambled, desperate to deny it, to fight against the possibility. But deep down, something inside him had already begun to crack. Flashes of that night flickered like a broken film reel, drunken voices echoing off the dorm walls. Daniel shouting, shoving, then nothing. Just emptiness. A void where a memory should have been. Emily took a step forward, her expression eerily calm. "We needed to know if it would come back to you. If you'd piece it together on your own. But you didn't. Not until we pushed you." James swallowed hard, his throat dry as sandpaper. "What did I do?" His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the dead silence of the room, it felt deafening. Ryan tilted his head, eyes gleaming with something unreadable. That's the thing, James. You tell us. The words sent a sickening wave of nausea through him. This wasn't just about Daniel. It had never been about some simple betrayal, some affair. It was something bigger, something that had been festering for years. His stomach twisted as another memory jolted through him. Daniel's face, furious, his hands shoving James hard enough to send him stumbling. James had been drunk, too drunk. There had been shouting, accusations. Someone had grabbed something glass-shattering, the sharp sting of adrenaline, then blackness. Then Ryan, standing over him, breathless, eyes wild. "We have to fix this." James's heart slammed against his ribs. "No," he whispered, shaking his head, stepping back like he could physically escape the truth. "No, Ryan's smirk widened, but there was no amusement in it. "It's funny, isn't it? How the mind protects itself. You buried it so deep, you really believed you were just another victim in all of this." James's vision blurred. His pulse pounded in his skull. He had spent years haunted by the mystery of Daniel's disappearance, convinced there had to be something more, some dark truth lurking just out of reach. And now, here it was. It had been him. A sick, hollow feeling settled in his chest. But something didn't fit. If he had killed Daniel, if this had all been about covering it up, why go through the elaborate game? The messages, the threats, the staged affair, none of it made sense. If you already knew, why do this? Why drag me through all of this? His voice was hoarse, raw. Emily's eyes darkened. Because someone else remembers James. Someone who wasn't supposed to. Before he could react, the sound of a door creaking open sliced through the silence. Footsteps echoed against the walls, slow and deliberate. And then, stepping into the dim light, Daniel. James's body locked up, the air vanishing from his lungs. It was impossible. Impossible. He was dead. He had to be. But there he stood alive, breathing, his eyes filled with something between fury and satisfaction. "You didn't kill me, James." Daniel's voice was low, cold. "But you left me for dead." James swayed where he stood, his mind unable to process the reality in front of him. He wanted to speak, to say something, anything, but no words came. Ryan exhaled sharply, shaking his head. And just like that, the last piece falls into place. He turned to Daniel. "Took you long enough?" James's stomach twisted. They knew. They had known he was alive. They had been playing him this entire time. Daniel's gaze never left James. "You want the truth?" He stepped closer. "You were drunk. We fought. You knocked me out cold. I don't even think you knew what you were doing. But Ryan?" He tilted his head. "Ryan knew exactly what he was doing when he dragged my unconscious body into the trunk of his car and dumped me in a river." The room spun. James staggered, bile rising in his throat. He looked at Ryan, whose expression remained frustratingly neutral. "You tried to kill him," James rasped. Ryan shrugged. "I finished what you started." Emily crossed her arms. "And he survived. And now he's come back to finish what he started." James barely had time to process the words before Daniel lunged. The impact sent them both crashing to the ground, fists flying, raw, desperate. Years of buried rage exploded between them, punches landing with bone-crushing force. James fought wildly, his mind split between survival and the horror of the truth unraveling around him. Then, a sharp pain. He gasped, his body going rigid. A knife. Warmth spread across his stomach, hot and thick. He looked down, blinking in disbelief as blood seeped through his shirt. Daniel stood over him, breathing heavily, the blade shaking in his grip. "You left me for dead," he whispered. "Now you know how it feels." James's body slumped back against the cold floor. His vision blurred, the room spinning, sounds fading. Emily and Ryan stood in the shadows, watching, waiting. As the darkness closed in, the last thing James saw was Emily leaning down, whispering into his ear. "We told you from the start, James." Her voice was almost tender. "You should have never started digging." And then nothing. The world felt distant, like James was floating somewhere between consciousness and oblivion. His body was heavy, numb, but the pain in his gut still burned like fire. His ears rang with the echoes of that final whisper, Emily's voice still lingering in his mind. You should have never started digging. And maybe she was right. Maybe if he had just let things go, he wouldn't be bleeding out on the cold floor of this godforsaken place. Maybe, if he had never questioned the past, he wouldn't have uncovered the truth that had been waiting for him all along. But then again, wasn't that always the way things ended for people like him? The ones who couldn't leave well enough alone? Somewhere in the haze, voices swirled around him. Ryan and Emily speaking in hushed tones, their words slipping in and out of his grasp. Daniel standing over him, his breath ragged, the knife still clutched in his hand. It should have been over. James should have felt himself slipping, fading into the abyss. But he didn't. Instead, a strange clarity began to settle over him, his mind cutting through the pain, through the panic, through the fear. And in that moment, he realized something they hadn't counted on. They thought they had won. James felt his lips curve into the faintest smirk, barely a twitch of his mouth. But it was enough to catch Daniel's attention. "You think this is funny?" Daniel's voice was raw, edged with years of anger, of betrayal, of barely contained rage. "After everything, you're still." James let out a weak, rasping chuckle. "They played you too." The words stopped, Daniel cold. His grip tightened on the knife, his jaw clenched, but James saw the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Because the truth was, Daniel had been just as much a pawn in this as James had. He had spent years believing he had all the answers, believing that Ryan and Emily had been his allies in the shadows, that they had worked with him, not against him. But what if that had never been the case? What if Daniel had been nothing more than a weapon, sharpened and aimed in the right direction, just waiting for the moment to strike? Ryan sighed, shaking his head. "Always the dramatics, James. You just don't know when to quit, do you?" He stepped forward, crouching down beside him, his expression one of almost genuine disappointment. "It's over. You lost. Just close your eyes and let it happen." But James didn't. He couldn't. Because in that moment, he saw something that made his pulse spike, his blood run cold. Flashing lights. The distant wail of sirens cutting through the night air. Someone had called the police. Ryan heard it too. His face darkened, his jaw tightening, and for the first time since this nightmare began, James saw it panic. Emily's calm facade cracked, her eyes darting toward the door, her mind racing through the possibilities. They had been careful, meticulous. No loose ends, no risks. But something had gone wrong. Someone had tipped them off.